The Zealot gene, with its referencing of scripture, to RökFlöte, which sees Anderson rubbing shoulders with pagan Norse gods. More delving than living in the past, it seems. Ian Anderson seems to enjoy these little archaeological excavations into our past, mythologised or not. Of course, we had the wonderful Songs from the Wood with its exploration of the myths and lore of merry old England. But this one sees Anderson turn his attention to Scandinavian myths and legend, and digs around for his own ancestral foundations. But for the most part, the album centres around the characters, roles and principal gods in Norse paganism. Anderson, in order to prepare himself for this album, studied a lot of what we call pre-Christian beliefs, which has led him down a fascinating path exploring animistic cave paintings and representations of polytheistic faiths in Asia, Greek and of course the Roman era. One thing you can say about this album is it's hugely atmospheric, as it explores all the narratives that were eventually displaced by Christianity in the 11th century. Ian Anderson, he not only explores the culture and history of those Viking nations, but also looks to delve into the foundations of his own history. In fact, he says that, I've often wondered as to my possible Scandinavian ancestry, whether of Norwegian or Swedish or Danish descent. My DNA analysis suggests that my tribe, at least on my father's side, most likely originated in the Balkans and migrated to Neolithic times through Western Europe and perhaps northwards into Scandinavia. So you can overall get the thematic arc and flavour of this album. Anderson has always felt like a somewhat dryly ironic, detached observer of human behaviour. Of course, we've got those wonderful vignettes on the Aqualung album, as well as the Thick as a Brick that dealt with these philosophical issues, cunningly masquerading behind the poetry of a schoolboy, and a passion play. Of course, who could forget the passion play, where intriguing commentary on the afterlife and the possibility of divine judgment. The first and last pieces on this album are enlarged spoken word pieces, with often the spoken word coming from a Reykjavik actress and singer, Una Berner. I hope I've said that correctly. They are effectively taken from the translation of the Poetic Edda, compiled from the 13th century Codex Regius, which was effectively a collection of Old Norse poems. This album is very similar to the Zealot gene. If you like that one, I think you will enjoy this one. Certainly in terms of its lots of rich acoustic textures and range of instrumentation, and some trademark wheezy flute flourishes. In terms of Anderson's voice, we get the familiar tuneful speaking, which is kind of where his voice is at the moment. It doesn't allow for much variation in tone, I think. At times it sounds more like a poetry recital to music. Anderson said for this album he toyed with the idea of making it an instrumental record. I can't help but feel that I wish it would, really, because I think his understanding of music, theme and concept could be beautifully explored in that way, rather than putting all that strain on his voice. Although this album is thematically weighty, it never overwhelms the listener because the music is so delicate and intricate and beautiful, really, so it perfectly platforms these ideas. It also helps, of course, that Anderson surrounds himself with some highly skilled musicians, there's no doubt about that. That is what passes now as the current iteration of Jethro Tull. Personally, I feel that Jethro Tull are at their very best when it's not just the proficient musicianship, but individual personalities that very, very much impose themselves upon this music, and certainly in the live context. The album's structure is essentially 12 songs based on the characters and roles of some principal gods in, as I said, Norse paganism. The lyrics are written in the form of a poem which describe the settings, identities and personalities of the different gods. But what is quite interesting, according to Anderson, is that the final 4 stanzas of each song, except the first and last tracks, are a different personalised interpretation of those subjects in a more contemporary setting. Hence, we get that same kind of observational milieu that you got with the Zealot gene. I like the idea behind the Zealot gene, this suggestion that human nature hasn't changed that much, really seem to underpin a lot of these little observational numbers that he did on that, and the application of scripture. The title is partly inspired by Ragnarok from Norse mythology. It essentially means destiny of the gods, if I'm not mistaken. The rock part, of course, meaning destiny and direction, and then he's added flute with this specifically Nordic spelling as a kind of a joke, really, to destiny, destination, flute. I think that's what he's getting at here. And the cover is very much a cave painting, as Andersen pays tribute to those pre-Christian civilizations. Andersen said himself of the title that the title of this offering went through a little change or two along the way. I started with the idea of predominantly instrumental album for rock flute, as in rock music. When the subject material of the album presented itself, I was drawn to the term Ragnarok from Norse mythology, their version of apocalyptic end times or biblical Armageddon. There are no songs of any great length on this album. They're fairly short and concise. And if you'll forgive me for quoting the progressive aspect, there is a seamless momentum to the tracks as a whole, and without flowing into one another, a feeling of something more epic is achieved. And for sure, I think the diversity of the music and the colourings are pretty effective here, certainly suggesting something of greater substance. Andersen's flute playing is excellent on this album. He gives some wonderful lyrical flourishes as well. As we go through the tracks on this album, I won't go through all of them, I'll just talk about some of my favourites. The first track is Voluspo, I hope I've said that right, which starts off with some heavy breathing and Scandinavian dialogue. Sounds like my VHS collection from the 1980s, to be honest with you. Before that segues into the low murmur of flute and some keyboard sounds that remind me a little bit of Velvet Green. Andersen's spoken word on this is platformed by some hard driving guitar. And Unga Gap, I think that's how you pronounce it, lovely wheezing, rumbling flute intro and chugging electric guitar, but of course you know this one, it's been released already. Plus we get Andersen's familiar strangulated vocal, a bit like mine at the moment, I think. The Navigators, of course, takes inspiration from the ice giant Ymir, a proto-being of a primeval being that was born from venom that dripped from the icy rivers called the Elvagar. God, I hope I get all these pronunciations correct. And lived in the grassless void of Gap. I think Andersen does this to me on purpose, you know. All Father is a pleasant number. Reminds me a little bit of Living in the Past. Classic Tull vibe. The double-track vocal of Andersen gives the impression of a plural of voices, perhaps asking for some kind of response. Hence, perhaps the idea of the actual song, the desire to petition and interventionist God. It seems to take the form of a dialogue. Andersen, not a believer in an interventionist God, is perhaps being a tad ironic here. The heavy door closed with a thud, he sings, which is perhaps rather telling. The Feathered Consort, nice classic Tull intro. Hammer on hammer, has a nice delicate start to it. With the epic line, was there a time when I was Jupiter? Obviously this song seems to explore the Thor myth. Andersen's vocal here is quite interesting as he adds seems to add a bit more variation to his singing, especially with trying to reach for the higher notes. And certainly with the use of double tracking and effects as well. It's punctuated with some blistering guitar work, and I love the keyboard flourishes as well. This is all, of course, underpinned some double-tracked guitar, which sounds all very Wishbone Ash. Wolf on Chain starts with the howl of a wolf, which seems quite appropriate, really. It perfectly sums up this idea of the icy Scandinavian forest, referencing even St. Jerome's letter 108, Wolves of the North, or something like that. The perfect one is a seriously catchy tune, I'll give it that. I love the acoustic strumming and layered flute at the beginning. The Trickster and the Mistletoe has a nice jig feel to it. Cornucopia, one of my favourites on this album. Ian's voice is interesting here and more varied. It's all platformed by some delightful music. And the Navigators, which is another one we already are already familiar with. I love that sense of that hard driving sound pushing forward. It reminds me a little bit of Locomotive Breath. It also has a keyboard sound that slightly reminds me of the Tull's Broadsword era. The Guardian's Watch starts with a beautiful flute trill, quite a heavy number. In fact, that's similar in tone and mood, I think, to the previous song. And finally, the last piece is a spoken piece in large, I think, which makes fascinating use of that wonderful actress, Anna Burner. I think that's what her name was, Andy Burnham. No, not him. More of this, please. I loved that. If we could have had an album, I think there was more to do using her voice and this remarkable ability Anderson has for music and lyrical concepts as well. I think I would have perhaps enjoyed it more. Overall, as I'll repeat what I said, if you like the Zealot gene, you will like this album. I will leave you with my closing salvo, which is, hope you're staying safe and well and cold free, and most of all that you keep listening.